Hello and welcome to the next stop on my journey through philosophy. So I've been making videos on topics in philosophy now. This is in the fifth section of those videos, which is on the question of what a human being is, what is a person, what we might call philosophical psychology. And I've done three other videos on what is a human person. This is the last of those videos, the fourth one, which is on free will and determinism. To what extent are human beings free? Or are they completely determined in what they do? This is a big question. Now, I'm doing this from one Christian perspective, namely mine. This is one area where there's a lot of disagreement among Christians. There's certain Christians who would say, well, you're a heretic if you don't believe it this way. Whereas I would say that there is a little bit of, there's more than one position that a Christian could take on this particular issue, in my opinion. And I'm going to talk about some of these things as we go through this video. So the first thing I want to do is I want to distinguish between the freedom to act and the freedom to will. Sometimes people say, well, look, I got up, I'm free. You know, I can do all kinds of things. I have free will. But what I just demonstrated was freedom to act. There is nothing constraining me right now. I'm not chained to this chair to where I can't get up. But that's not free will, you know, in my opinion. Now, for some people it is. But for me, is he going to get up? Is he not going to get up? I decided not to get up. To me, that's not really free will. That simply shows that I'm not constrained. I'm free to act. So I want to distinguish to begin free will from free act. At least, and I'm going to define free will in a very robust sense, but more on that in a second. Now, I do want to point out that our wills are complex things. Now, I'm looking out of these two eyes, but even then, my brain kind of, unifies the input into both of my eyes. I perceive myself to be a single individual looking out. Now, there are allegedly individuals with multiple personalities. And sometimes we talk about, well, there are two sides to this person. You know, there's the saint and there's the sinner. If you were to look inside my head, you would find, I think, a brain. I mean, I think there's a brain there. But anyway, there are parts to my brain. My brain is not just one thing. I think it was Rene Descartes who thought of the soul as being in the pituitary gland. So he kind of thought there's this one little control panel, like on Inside Out, where you have the different emotions there at the control panel of the person. Even there are multiple inputs there, right? The soul is not, maybe the soul is a singular I, capital I, yeah, I mean, I don't know, maybe it is. But in terms of my brain, there's a lot of parts there. There's a lot of parts in my brain. There's the hypothalamus, there's the limbic system that it's a part of, there's the cerebral cortex. There's stuff going on there. In my opinion, there is no human being that is a singular will, but we have a mixture of conflicting impulses. I know there are days when I can go from being on top of the moon to being discouraged to being angry. There's not a single will inside my brain. And so life is a series of choices. It just is. How did I get here into this video right now? I actually did not, it was only about 15 minutes ago that I thought, oh, why don't I do that free will video? There were competing things for me to do today. I was dating someone once, and I had to make a choice. I kind of knew what they wanted me to do, but I felt like I really needed to, that I had to do this other thing, that this other thing had to do with my duty. And so even though I know that they preferred me to do something else, I felt like I had to go with what I needed to do. Well, I remember them being upset, and I said, I'm sorry, but I had to do that. I didn't have a choice. And the response was something like, you do what you want. People do what they want. as if there's a single want. We are not single wants. We are conflicting wants. And in fact, it's our choices that define us more than anything else. I mean, I realize in the outside world, it may not be our choices that define us. But in terms of God, which matters, and in terms of who we really are, it is our choices that define who we are. And there can be multiple impulses. There can be multiple temptations upon us, multiple drives. We have multiple wills in play at the same time. I think that's an important piece of this puzzle. So for me, freedom of will suggests that I at least experience a freedom to decide what I want. Now, I have a more robust sense of free will than even this, but okay, at the very least, freedom of will, free will means that I at least experience my choices as free. Okay, I'm going to go either to the right or left. I don't know which I'm going to go yet. Which am I going to go to the right or am I going to go to left? I don't know which one, but I perceive myself as free to choose one. Okay, I went that way, which for me was left. Why did I make that choice? I don't know. I really don't. Actually, I probably do, because my first thought was to go right, and I thought, no, I'm not going to go okay. But I experienced that as free will. So at least free will means the freedom to choose what you want to do. And then the freedom to act is the freedom to do what you choose. Okay, I do want to talk about becoming freer. I wasn't quite sure where to put this in this series, but I do want to say, I thought of Francis Bacon's quote that knowledge is power. Now, Bacon lived in the late 1500s, early 1600s, I believe. Francis Bacon, what he meant by this is that the person, if you know stuff, you can do more stuff. And the way I sometimes put it in philosophy class is, if you only know this choice, then you're not really free to make any other choice. You're a slave to that choice. That by knowing other options, even if you pick the same option you were going to anyway, you now pick it freely because you know what the other options are. And so knowledge is power, and we can become freer. The idea of education, part of the idea of education is that you become a much more powerful individual. I have a colleague here. I teach at Indiana Wesleyan University as I'm making this video. I have a colleague in the Honors College by the name of David Riggs. He calls the liberal arts the liberating arts. And liberal arts aren't liberal. That term goes a long way into the past, long before modern debates. Liberal means free. And so there's a sense in which the liberal arts are the freeing arts, the liberating arts. The idea is that if you know more options, like if you take a philosophy class, then you know more options than you knew before. You're freer in your choices you make. If you take a music class, you become freer with regard to beauty. You become freer with regard to art. If you take an art class, because you now know more options. You see more. You see the landscape better. You're not just locked in a cave like Plato talked about in the myth of the cave, but now you have a bigger set of options to take from. I think I might also, I agree completely with that perspective, that the purpose of an education is to make freer people. I really do. As I look at the current mess right now in politics, as I look at the current, it's 2018 as I make this video. 2016 was the election between Clinton and Trump was elected. As I look at the mess that we've been in for the last few years, I seriously believe that many Americans, and on both sides, this is not a one-sided thing, are slaves to a lack of knowledge. That we do not know the other options, or we do not know them fairly. Maybe we have a skewed version of our perspective. I mean, just follow the Twitter feeds. I've seen both. Right now, as I make this video, we are in the midst of whether or not the nominee Brett Kavanaugh for the Supreme Court, whether he is going to be supported or not in the Senate. And you watch the Twitter feeds. So here's the liberal Twitter feed, here's the conservative Twitter feed, and it's like both of them are slaves to one train of thought. They don't understand the other train of thought. They don't want to understand the other train of thought. They're locked in. This is what's true. And I'm not going to look at any other position. I'm not going to listen to any other people. I'm not going to even open my mind to the possibility that I might be wrong in some way. That's a slave. That's not a free person. That's a person who's, in fact, if you know what they're going to say, before they've heard the evidence, they are determined. They're not free. A person who has their mind made up before they see the evidence or hear the arguments, that person is not a free person. That's a slave. That's a determined person. And the overwhelming majority of people in the world are slaves, intellectual slaves, shall we say. And so in that sense, the purpose of a liberal arts education, one of them, is to liberate you to become a free person intellectually. Of course, I needed to throw Kant in here somewhere, and there are many people who think this. I think I understand what Kant's saying here, and what others are saying. I've heard preachers say things like this. I'm having a difficult time. I'm having trouble. Maybe I need to be educated. Maybe I need to be freed from the slavery of my thinking. Either unless I just don't fully get it, or I don't agree with it. Right now, I'm leaning toward I don't agree with it. So Kant would say that freedom is acting in accordance with how you were made. And I think the Stoics would agree with Kant, for example. I think there are some probably Calvinist philosophers who would agree with Kant. The idea here is that humans were made to be a certain way, and that if you submit to that way, then you're free. But if you're always fighting against what you were made to be, then you're not free. You're a slave to something else. That may make sense to you. I'm still chewing on it. But I thought I'd throw it. I thought I needed to have it in this video because it is a not little embraced perspective. Okay, now back to things that make sense to me. There are differing definitions of free will, to be sure. So I talked about, at the very minimum, there is kind of the base sense of free will that I experience myself as having the freedom to decide what I want to choose. In other words, I think I have free will. This is basically the Calvinist version. We'll talk about Calvinism in a little bit here. The Calvinist version of free will is this way. A man named William James called this soft determinism, because this is compatible with me not actually being free. I just experience myself as free. So, for example, we are often manipulated by others. I'm very paranoid about this. I don't want others to be manipulating me. But there are others who know what gets us going. This is, of course, what allegedly happened during the 2016 election, right? The idea is that hackers or people got into Facebook and Twitter and began stirring the American pot. The current consensus is that Russian hackers got in and on both sides stirred up very conservative and very liberal people to where we were all in a frenzy, a polarized frenzy. And I think the majority would say, I think the majority of experts on these sorts of things would agree with what I'm about to say, and that is this: that although everybody getting angry on Facebook, everybody getting angry on Twitter, they experience that as their free will. So I experience myself as having the freedom to decide. They all experience themselves as freely voting for who they voted for, or they experience themselves as freely being angry at the fact that Hillary Clinton was running a sex traffic ring out of some bar in Washington, D.C. Remember that, where this guy shows up with a gun at a restaurant where he'd read something on the internet that there was a sex trafficking ring being run by Hillary Clinton. I mean, this guy was completely manipulated by, say, the Russians and the things that they were putting on. Now, you might say, well, Ken, you think it's the Russians. You're being completely manipulated by the liberal media. And maybe I am. Although there is a kind of majority of experts things. America doesn't believe in experts. This is part of our anti-intellectual heritage. America has a kind of a sense that, oh, you're smart, you must be wrong. You know a lot about science. Ooh, I shouldn't listen to you about science. I mean, that's irrational, frankly, but that's American culture. But anyway, so this level of free will simply says that I experience myself as being free to make decisions, even though I'm actually potentially very manipulated by other people and forces. So this is free will. So a Calvinist might say, I believe in free will, but it's this kind of soft deterministic free will. That is, I experience myself to have free will. What I want to argue for is a much more robust sense of free will, where you actually, on some level, now what level that is a matter of great debate, that on some level, a human being has the ability to decide what they want without that decision being a product of forces outside their control. So I would call this libertarian freedom. Now, to be honest, let me just be honest, that I don't think that we are free in this way very much. We can become much freer. The more that we know the forces that are on us, the freer that we can become. And at least we can be, to some extent, internally free. You know what I mean? That amidst the conflict of voices in our head, amidst the conflict of impulses and temptation, and amidst the things going on inside, the more I'm aware of the forces outside, I can come to the point to where my brain is able to freely make decisions that are independent of the forces outside my head. And I'm aware of the forces on me as much to a great degree. And I'm making a decision based upon what's in my head. However, I'm hinting here at something that goes even further. And that is particularly when it comes to choosing God. Does God perform a miracle in every human's life? Is it possible that at some point in every person's life, the Holy Spirit empowers us to make an ex nihilo decision, a choice out of nothing, for or against God? Is that possible? In that sense, we can believe in total depravity. That is the idea that humans have no power to choose God in themselves. But because the Holy Spirit powers us up just enough to make that choice, that every human being at some point in their life can make at least one truly free will decision, and that is for or against God, an empowered decision in which God makes it possible for us to create a decision out of nothing, as it were. Well, these are the issues of free will. Let me just talk about some forms of determinism. Determinism means, of course, that your decisions are determined and that your desires are determined to some extent. On a popular level, of course, there's fatalism. Somebody who's fatalist basically says, hey, when it's your time to go, it's your time to go. Que sera, sera, whatever will be, will be. The future's not ours to see. Que sera, sera. Anyway, so this kind of fatalism doesn't necessarily believe anybody's in control of what's happening, or that there are three fates, who cut the string when you die. Fatalism just basically means, what's going to happen is going to happen, and there's nothing you can do about it. I'm not this at all. I mean, good grief. So let's say that there's a plane you're about to get on, and you can see that the engine isn't fully attached, or that oh look, the screws, the bolts to the tail aren't completely screwed in. And you're not going to say to yourself, well, when it's your time to go, it's your time to go. I'm going to get on the plane anyway. No, that would be rather stupid. So I don't think this really is a good, healthy, certainly not a good philosophical approach to life. A fatalism that says, hey, everything happens that's going to happen, and there's nothing you can do about it. So I'm just going to step into moving traffic with my eyes closed, because when it's your time to go, it's your time to go. No, that's stupid. Don't do that. But there are people who are very fatalist in their approach. I've already mentioned soft determinism, also called compatibilism, and I mentioned William James. The idea here is that we experience ourselves as free even though our decisions are completely determined. I think there is a lot of truth in that, right? There is a lot of truth in that. That if you're really wise, you can predict what a lot of people are going to do. Now, of course, sometimes people find out that you're going to predict that they're going to do something, and they do the opposite. But even then, it's just like one more chess move out. We are, I mean, whether we like it or not, to a very large extent, we are not free. We think we are. We experience ourselves as free, but to a very large extent, we really aren't. I'm trying to carve a space philosophically for at least freedom in one point, and that one point is whether or not we choose God. And I do think that there is this inside-outside freedom, that I can become more and more aware of the forces on me from the outside, and then to within a kind of common sense language, speak of freedom of inside my head to make choices. There was a guy named Baron Dolbach, who basically said, let's just not even talk about freedom at all. We're not free. We're just billiard balls being hit by that great cube of the Lord Creator, and the balls are just going where they're going, and eventually they're going. You know, if we knew the physics, if we knew all the math and the starting point, we would be able to predict where everything would be for the rest of eternity. This was the view very much in the 1600s, hard determinism. And then, of course, there's the issue of predestination, which is a religious perspective. To what extent does God decide who's going to be saved and who isn't? Okay, let me throw in here another one that sometimes comes up, and that's Molinism. Molinism is the idea that God has, first of all, God has middle knowledge. What is middle knowledge? Middle knowledge is a knowledge of all the possible outcomes of something. So middle knowledge assumes that if this happens, then this will happen. But if this happens, then this will happen. And then God knows all the different, he knows all the different scenarios. So God has all the storyboards of creation in his mind. He knows exactly how every scenario will play out. Now, Molinism is an interesting perspective. I would consider, who's the guy, Craig? William Lane Craig. William Lane Craig out at Biola, is it Talbot School of Theology, and he's at other places too, Baylor and such. William Lane Craig, sometimes people say that he believes in free will, but if I understand correctly, he's really a Molinist. What that means is he believes that we are free, but that God has predestined everything that will happen on the basis of his middle knowledge. So God knew that if X happened, we would choose A. But if Y happened, we would choose B. And God knows that we would freely choose A or B, depending on X and Y. And so we are free in our choice, but what God does is God predestines X or Y. And so if God predestines Y, he knows we will freely choose B. And so we have free will because we freely choose B. But God is predestining everything because he chose Y. And so it is a very, very sophisticated way of harmonizing us having free will with God predestining everything. So God predestines the things that will result in the free will that he wants us to have. I personally think that this is just basically a sophisticated form of determinism. And it still doesn't protect God. It still does not reconcile the idea that God is love, because God is still, for all intents and purposes, sending people to hell without any choice. Well, okay. So I reject all of the things on this slide. I accept predestination in terms of God predestining the plan of salvation. I don't think that God predestines individuals to be saved. He lets us and he makes it possible for us to make that choice in my theology. Okay, I have to throw in a slide on indeterminism. There's so many angles here. I could do multiple videos here. I needed to throw in a slide on indeterminism. Because so back in the days of Newton, in the 1600s, scientists looked at everything as deterministic. It was in the year 1700, the best scientists believed that everything that happens is determined, it would seem. Now, that's not the case today. The best scientists today believe that everything is undetermined. And there's in particular in quantum physics something called Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle basically says that we cannot know, for example, both the position and momentum of a particle with certainty. That the better we know the position of a particle, the less we know the momentum of a particle. And the better we know the momentum of a particle, the less we know the position of a particle. Basically, there is, on the quantum level, the math goes with probabilities. And so there is a kind of certainty on the quantum level. That is, if we have 10,000 atoms, we know the cumulated average of where they're going to be. However, quantum physics would say, not only do we not know where an electron is, a specific electron at a specific point in time, but quantum physics would generally say today, the electron isn't at a specific place at a specific point. And so we don't, there's a famous story about Schrodinger's cat, about a cat that's in a box, and there is a poison gas that, depending on the uncertainty of a particular particle, either the gas will be released or the gas won't be released. Well, we can't predict, basically. What Schrodinger said is that if the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics is true, then we don't know whether the cat's alive or dead. There is no math or science that will be able to predict whether or not the cat is alive or dead. We basically have to open up the box to find out whether it's alive or dead. That it simply is uncertain scientifically what's going to happen. You cannot predict the future on that level of specificity. Of course, Schrodinger was kind of mocking the Copenhagen interpretation when he came up with this scenario. But this is pretty much where most quantum physicists are today. That you just cannot predict exactly what's going to happen. There's a fundamental uncertainty on the quantum level to the universe. And so the problem of science today is not determinism. That was the problem in the 1600s. But the problem coming from science today is uncertainty, the indeterminism of the fundamental future. That the future is not written on the basis of the past, at least not on that kind of very, very micro level. Okay, what are some of the elements in this equation? So are we going to come to an answer, Ken? I don't know, probably not, but I'll give you my answer. What are the elements in the equation? Well, for some people, their theology of God's sovereignty comes into play. So for a really hyper-Calvinist, if humans have any freedom at all, for them, that would make God not being in control. God would not be sovereign. He would not be in control if there's any choice on the human's part. That's almost a blasphemous thing to say for some of those people. Well, to me, this is, again, to be honest, that's kind of stupid. Because, as a parent, let's say that I take my son to Burger King, and I say, hey, son, my son's 19 now, so he can pay for his own Burger King. But let's say I go with my son to Burger King, and I say, son, I'm going to pay for your dinner tonight, if you'll let me. What do you want? Order anything off the menu. Now, have I then ceased to be, or let's say that, so in that case, well, I've granted him, I've said, even if you'll let me pay. Does that mean, oh, you're weak, you're a weak father, Ken? I should probably pick more a colonel. Let's say there's a colonel in the Army talking to a private, and the colonel says, son, I'm buying your meal. That's an order. You can either have a Whopper or you can have a chicken sandwich. What I'm getting at is giving someone a choice. You can, as the one in control, give a choice to the person who is under you. And that doesn't mean you're less the boss, right? The colonel, the general's not going to pull the colonel into their office and says, I'm demoting you down to lieutenant colonel because you let a private decide what kind of sandwich they want. I mean, that's just stupid. You can be in control and let someone make a choice. Well, I just don't get it. Okay, moving right along. There's, of course, biology and genetics, the whole question of nature versus nurture. Let me tell you right now, I don't like artichoke. I don't know that that's, I don't know whether that's because my mother didn't fix much artichoke, or maybe that just the genetics of my tongue. I don't know. Somebody may know the answer to this, but definitely biology and genetics play a role in the choices I make. In that sense, let's say, and I don't know this for sure, let's just say that there's something genetic about my tongue that makes me not like artichoke. Well, then when I don't choose artichoke, did I freely not choose artichoke, or were there forces on me that pushed me away from picking artichoke? So that's an element in the equation. I've just mentioned the indeterminacy on the nuclear level. There's something called chaos theory. You may have heard of the butterfly effect. The butterfly effect is the idea that small changes in one point can create huge changes somewhere else. So let's say there's a butterfly in Australia that changes the wind currents a little bit. Could it be that that would create a hurricane in South Florida? What we're getting at here is that the indeterminacy of the nuclear level can have major impact upon the way the future plays out. And then the question of the soul is another factor in this equation. I'm not going to argue one way or the other in this video. We've talked about the soul in previous videos in this section, but the idea of the soul really helps free will, because if I have a soul, then you can say that there is a part of me, a simple part of me somewhere associated with me, maybe in another dimension, that can make a decision outside of the flow of cause and effect in this world. It's at least a potential source for free will in this discussion, if there would be a soul that is part of me. Okay, now let me mention the tulip. These are things that just seem to need to be mentioned in a video on free will. So the tulip comes from it's a Calvinist idea. It comes from debates in the Netherlands in the early 1600s over whether or not human beings have any role in their salvation. Can a human being on any level make a choice for God? And so this is after Calvin. It's in the Netherlands, but this would become kind of the orthodoxy of Calvinism ever since. So here are the elements of this kind of very much deterministic system. So the T stands for total depravity. The idea here is that human beings are incapable of making a choice in their own power for God. Therefore, according to Calvin, our election, whether or not I, Ken Schenck, make it to heaven or not, is unconditional. God has either elected me or he hasn't. It's unconditional. I do nothing to become elected because I can't. I'm totally depraved. I can't make a move for God. God has to make a move for me. And therefore, my election, according to the tulip, is unconditional. Therefore, Jesus only died for those who he chose. The idea here is Jesus didn't die for Hitler. Jesus only died for those who were chosen. Now, if God has chosen you, you're going to be chosen. He's going to give you, you're going to get your grace whether you want it or not. The fact of the matter is, in this system, we don't want it. It is unconditionally, we are unconditionally chosen, and therefore God gives us grace in a way that we could not possibly resist his grace. And of course, this implies, therefore, that once saved, we're always going to be saved. Because if God has chosen us and we cannot resist his grace, if he's chosen us, we're going to make it. We're going to make it to the end. We're going to make it from when we come to Christ to when we die. And so the saints, the ones who are chosen, they're going to persevere. So this is the tulip that came out of a council there in the Netherlands in the early 1600s to try to shut down Arminius. Jacob Arminius had already died, thankfully. They probably would have put him to death if he hadn't. But Arminius was arguing for against these kinds of perspectives within Calvinism. But here's a syllogism. Let's talk about the Bible. If God determines who will be saved, and God wants everybody to be saved, then everyone will be saved. This is the syllogism here. If God determines who will be saved, and he wants everybody to be saved, then everyone will be saved. So the question is 3 true? No, 3 is not biblical. According to the Bible, not everyone is saved. In fact, Revelation 20 talks about some being cast into a lake of fire. So since this is called a contrary to fact argument, since number 3 is not biblical, that means that either 1 or 2 has to be false. And so the Calvinist basically says that number 2 is false. And the person like me, the Wesleyan Arminian, says number 1 is false. But either 1 or 2 has to be false, at least in this universe, if 3 is not true. So number 2 has scripture to support it. Now, the Calvinists would say, well, I have scripture to support number 1 too. But we get into, this is where the debate happens. Is God love or is God not love? If God is love, then you would think he would want to save everybody who can be saved. And of course, since I believe that is the fundamental characteristic of God on these matters, then I have to go with that. Because I do not think that a God who doesn't save everybody who can be saved, that's not a God of love, at least not a very loving God. I'm more frankly, I'm more loving than that God. And it's impossible that I would be more loving than the real God, isn't it? If there's a human being who can love more than the real God, then there's a problem here. That can't happen. And therefore, okay, I'm going to put it very straight. Since I am more loving than the God of Calvin, since I am more loving than the God of Augustine, since I am more loving than the God of the Calvinist, then the God of the Calvinist must not be the real God. Plain and simple, that's the way it is, because God is love. And so therefore, the problem must be with number 1, at least in this universe. Now, maybe God can reconcile these things outside this universe. That's above my pay grade. But I'm going by what I can make of the Bible in this universe as best I can. And so therefore, I do not believe that number 1 is actually true. Okay, so number 1 is rejected by Wesleyan Arminians such as myself. Here is the Wesleyan perspective on an Arminian perspective, and I don't mean my church. I mean a broad. This would not just be Wesleyan too. A broad sense of people who believe in a kind of a free will when it comes to this. First of all, Wesleyans do technically believe in total depravity or thorough depravity. I might say that Romans 3 does not get into numbers. It's clear that we are thoroughly depraved. That is clear from Romans 3. We cannot choose God in our own power. However, Wesley introduces the idea of preventing or prevenient grace. This is a grace that goes ahead. So so in Calvinism, grace is an on or off switch. Either God turns the grace on or he doesn't. Either God turns on the election or he doesn't. I often say that within the Wesleyan Arminian tradition, grace is more like a dimmer switch. That God, and I realize this is probably taking the verse a little bit out of context, but God lightens everyone who comes into the world. Every human being, and this is my theology, every human being who has ever walked on this planet has had an opportunity for redemption, because at some point in their life, God has turned the light up just enough for their soul to say, more. And then if they've said more, God has turned the light up even more so that they could say, more. And eventually, that light turns up into what we would call saving grace. Now, what about those who've never heard? Well, that's not really what this video is about. But I grew up hearing in the Wesleyan Church that God judges people according to the light they have. This is probably something that comes from a Quaker, kind of a Quaker background. God judges us according to the light we have. And so I'm not going to, that's not the purpose of this video. But let's just say, so let's eliminate some of those issues and just come down to the question of a person who has heard the message of Jesus. They know the plan of how to be saved. Then I believe that God comes before. The Spirit comes and empowers them to either move toward Him or to sink back in to the darkness that is the default state of depravity. And so then they are, in other words, they are empowered to make the choice. They don't make the choice in their own power, but they are empowered by the Holy Spirit to be able to make that most basic choice. Therefore, election is conditional. And I would argue this, that even in Romans 9 through 11, in Romans 11 he says, have they fallen so much as to be lost? And he says, no, if they will repent. So wait a minute, you're saying that someone who isn't elected can become elected? Or in 1 Peter 1:10, be diligent to make your calling and election sure. Wait a minute, but if you can make your election more certain, then it must not be unconditional election. And in the words of Inigo Montoya in The Princess Bride, you'll keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means. Election simply must not mean what John Calvin thought it meant, or else these verses don't make any sense. So it's conditional election. And in fact, in Romans 8, those whom he called, those whom he chose, he called, those whom he called, he justified, and so forth. This is talking about the group. This is talking about the plan. This is the plan. This is the way, the plan, that the Western world is an individualist world. And so we read those verses individualistically, but this is more corporate language. The elect is a group. And it's kind of like I once talked about, let's say I have a class. You all are the elect who are taking Romans with me. What if somebody leaves the room? What if somebody comes in the room? Does that negate what I've just said? No, I'm talking about the group, not about the precise boundaries of who's in the room or who isn't in the room. And therefore, and I think this is very biblical, there is a universal availability of atonement. Limited atonement is not biblical, in my opinion. And of course, there are 4-point Calvinists who don't believe in limited atonement. And then it is a grace from which one might fall. Again, this is thoroughly in the New Testament, Hebrews especially. It is Hebrews 10:26. It is impossible for those who've been enlightened, who've tasted the heavenly gift. I'm quoting Hebrews 6. If they fall away, to renew themselves to repentance. Hebrews 10:26. If we continue to sin willfully after we receive knowledge of truth, there remains no more sacrifice for sins. Paul, let us not be as those who don't win the prize, but I discipline my body lest I should also become a castaway. There are plenty of verses that suggest that there are people who started out who didn't end up. Hebrews 3, did not they all who left under Moses, under the cloud, but their corpses fell in the desert. Now, therefore, let us be diligent to enter into that rest. There is effort involved in living the Christian life. Well, okay. These are matters of great debate, but these are my perspectives and some of the scriptures that I would use to support it. Therefore, there's a necessity for persistence. And this is very biblical in the New Testament. Okay, I've maybe given some of my explanations of Romans 9 through 11, that predestination is primarily about the plan rather than the individual people. The Romans 9, what is really going on in Romans 9? Romans 9 is about the inclusion of the Gentiles into the people of God. Romans 9 is not some abstract theology of predestination. Paul in Romans is talking about how it is that God is allowing the Gentiles in by faith. When Israel is the people of God, Israel are his people, then what is God doing letting these Gentiles in? And Paul's answer in Romans 9 is God can do whatever he wants because he's God. If God wants to bring in the Gentiles, God can bring in the Gentiles. Who are you to talk back to the Creator? Why have you made me thus? Anyway, Romans 9 is not an abstract doctrine of predestination. It's about God's plan with regard to the Gentiles primarily. And again, as I said, those in Romans 9 can actually change trajectory, which suggests that election is not quite as unconditional as it might sound at some point. Okay, Also, you have to also remember that the ancient world talked very fatalistically. It's a way of talking. And so we should not be it's not surprising at all that we find fatalistic language in the New Testament, because that's the way the culture talked to a very large extent. Okay, boy, I'm trying to slip in all these little twists and turns in this discussion. There is something called open theism. Open theism is the idea either it's the idea that God chooses not to know the future. So this is a Arminian heresy, as it were. It goes a little too far, I would say. Although I don't think that open theists are quite the heretics that some people think they are. I'm not an open theist at all. But open theists actually are arguably taking the Old Testament more literally than the rest of us. Again, I think they're taking it too literally. But basically, open theists would say that God chooses not to know the future. Why does God do that? Well, he either does it by self-limitation, because the idea here is that if God knew the future would be determined. But God wants us to have free will, so he doesn't determine the future. He decides, I'm not going to listen. I'm going to self-limit myself to the knowledge of the future. I don't like that version, by the way. I don't like that version of open theism at all. It accepts the argument that if God knows the future, therefore the future is determined. That doesn't make any sense to me at all, because if God is in some way outside time, then the fact that God has observed the future doesn't mean that he's determined the future. It's kind of like me watching a video of a game that I was at. I know the guy's going to make a touchdown because I was at the game. It doesn't mean I've determined that the guy's going to make a touchdown. And in the same way, if God's already seen the future, the fact that he knows it doesn't mean that he's determining the future. And so this version would say, well, they agree with that argument that I don't agree with, and would say, okay, so therefore, so that he doesn't determine the future, God has self-limited his knowledge. Now, it's not necessary. And then there are others who are a little bit more clever. They would say, well, the future doesn't exist. God knows everything. The fact that he doesn't know the future doesn't mean he doesn't know everything, because the future doesn't exist. Yeah, I don't buy any of that. But I respect it. These are not evil people. Not at all. In fact, these people often take the Old Testament very literally. Where are you, Adam? Who told you you were naked? Did you eat from the tree? I don't take these as real questions at all. But and God was sorry, Genesis 6:6, and God was sorry that he had made humanity. Well, no, God can't literally be sorry, because he knew this was going to happen. And so the open theists say, well, he didn't know. He was taking a chance. I don't buy that. I think that's just anthropomorphic language. It's even language of God getting angry. You get angry when new information happens, right? But if God knows everything, there's never any new information. What I'm saying is, I think that there's a lot of imagery in the Bible that is anthropomorphic, that helps us understand God by portraying God in human terms. But that's not literally the way it is. That's goo goo gaga to help us with our small little peanut brains. Okay, now some open theists would go so far. I'm thinking of Tom Ord, for example, who would say that because God is love, God cannot do any action that is coercive. Now, I don't understand love in this way. For example, let's say that I had a young child who was walking into the street. It is perfectly loving, I think, to restrain that child and to remove that child from the road. Now, the child may not experience that as loving. The child may start crying, why didn't you let me go in the street? But that's not unloving. And so the fact that God would stop the wicked, the fact that God would restrain forces of evil, that requires coercive action. And so I simply don't agree with those who would say that love is incompatible with any form of coercion whatsoever. Well, okay. So I'm not an open theist. I respect them. I really do. In many respects, I admire them for their heart. but I think they're wrong on some things. Okay, well, I've come to the end. So I should tell you what I think. I've talked about a lot of different options. One, I do believe that we are heavily determined, that we are far more determined than we realize. I do, though, too, make a distinction between what goes on inside my head and what goes outside my head. That to some extent, we can speak at least of freedom to will within our head. And that the more we know about the forces upon us, the more of the liberating arts, the more knowledge, the more education we have about the forces that are on us, then the freer we are inside our heads to make choices. Now, in reality, many of those choices are themselves determined by chemicals swirling around in our brain or by medication we're taking, our genetics. So there is a determinedness to what's in my head as well, to a very large extent. But I can become freer inside my head the more I know about what's outside my head. And then I do believe that with the matter of choosing God, that by God's power, by the power of the Holy Spirit, God empowers us to be able to make at least one ex nihilo choice in our life for or against God. And that's a God-empowered choice that God gives us at some point. And if we have a soul, that would be where that happens. Well, some thoughts on free will and determinism in our series on philosophy from one Christian perspective.